Hello, hello. This is Julia Wahl in her podcast How to Live, and today I have the pleasure of being in conversation with Russell Kolts. Welcome, Russell. And Russell Kolts is a licensed clinical psychologist, professor of psychology at Eastern Washington University, where he has taught for the past 16 years, if that's correct, or maybe a bit longer now, Russell. And you're of course you're also a writer, and I found this other brilliant description of who Russell is. So Russell Kolt's public persona is that of a perpetually chill, zen, super compassionate guy all of the time. And So I really like that description. And of course, Dr. Koltz has pioneered the application of compassion focused therapy, CFT, to the treatment of problematic anger. And you also conduct workshops, training programs. So you're a very, very busy person. You do jury duty. And two questions, if I may, to begin with. So first of all, anything else we should know about you, and what's problematic anger as opposed to, say, normal anger? So these two basic or not that basic questions to begin.
So, well, the first thing you should know is with regard to the description of me as perpetually chill and zen-like. The key phrase in there is public persona. I don't know where that came from, but anyone who knows me well would tell you a very different version, stories about a very different version of me. And the problematic anger, it's when we express anger in ways that get in the way. So probably a more accurate kind of description would be problematic manifestations of anger or problematic expressions of anger. I don't think anger in itself is good or bad, right or wrong, problematic or not. But when we don't know how to handle it, we can express it in ways that can cause problems in our lives. And so sometimes I think, I know I certainly will use shorthand and use the phrase problematic anger in lieu of the more unwieldy, poorly managed anger, or, anger that's expressed in ways that can cause us problems. But that's really what I think is meant by that phrase.
So can anger be of help to us, and how can be CFT of help when it comes to anger?
Yeah, I think anger is really, really helpful in a lot of ways. When people ask me about anger, is it good or bad or whatever, I think the phrase I'll use is, I'll say anger is a wonderful signal and often a terrible strategy. So anger is really good at alerting us to things in life that are problems for us, situations that cross our boundaries, or experiences that run across our values, or things like that. It's good at alerting us to things that are wrong, that we might want to address. So I think it's a wonderful signal. It orients us towards threats really well, just as it was designed to do. I think often in modern life, anger can be a terrible strategy because it's an outdated strategy in terms of how to address most of the problems most of us face in daily life. When you hear people say fight, flight, flee, fawn, those sorts of things, motivationally speaking, anger is what's behind the fight in fight or flight, right? It's motivating us in primarily aggressive ways. And, if we were, fighting another tribe in the savannah, or dealing with some other physical predator, 100,000 years ago, that could be very helpful maybe in terms of motivating us, focusing us, and energizing us to fight. But in most, stressors in modern life, aggression tends not to be a very adaptive strategy. And so if we sort of run with the energy of anger and just act kind of unthinkingly upon it, we can find ourselves in having lots of problems. So, but I think it's very useful in orienting us towards different things. And it's useful, honestly, in getting us off the couch. Anger has a certain
Mm,
energy that can help fuel things like assertiveness. It can help us
mm,
if we can sort of mitigate its influence, if we recognize I'm angry, and if we can pause for a moment between the anger and the execution, what we say or do, it can motivate us to speak up and to stand up for things that we care about. But uh, often I think to really be effective, say in the realm of activism, we have
mm.
to find ways to transfer or transform that anger into something like compassion or assertiveness or something that's a little more functional in terms of how it plays out.
So compassion, and namely CFT, how can CFT be of help when it comes to anger?
Well, I think that CFT can be of help because it helps us to relate to anger in helpful and functional ways. So I think that when we're someone, like, in some cases in my life, if we're someone who struggles with manifesting anger in unhelpful ways, there are a
Mm,
few sort of ways we can do that. One is just by sort of disappearing into it and in an unfiltered way, just
mm,
acting out on it, maybe saying and doing things that are hurtful, um, relating to others in kind of explosive ways, things like that. Even some people even can be destructive and physically aggressive, right?
mm.
Um, you know, Let me think here.
Compassion, and namely CFT, how can
Yes,
CFT be
yeah.
of help when we experience anger?
I started talking about anger and I lost the CFT. So the whole problem is we can get lost in anger. And another
Mm,
unhelpful way of relating to anger is through avoidance. So a lot of
mm,
us sort of know we have experiences of acting out anger in ways that have been
mm,
unhelpful. And so it can be really tricky to say, "Oh, I feel angry," or "I'm struggling with anger." And so we can just sort of avoid it. And we can do this in lots of different
mm,
ways. We can rationalize it. We can
mm,
rationalize our behavior when we've been angry. We can blame the other person. Blaming, I think, is
mm,
an avoidance strategy that isn't named that often. But I
mm,
think if we think about it, when we behave in ways that really don't fit with the kind of people we want to be, but
mm,
then we notice that could be kind of painful. It can be shaming. But if we can
mm,
externalize it, if we can say, I only did that because you did this, I only said
mm,
that to you because you did that, then it sort of lets us off the hook. And it keeps us from
mm,
taking responsibility for our own behavior because we framed it in such a way that makes it seem like it's not our responsibility. Like I only did that because they did this. And then,
mm,
sort of a third unhelpful way of relating to anger is through self-criticism and self-attacking.
mm,
So we notice ourselves maybe behaving out of anger in ways that aren't helpful, but instead of pausing and thinking, "Wait, this is not the father or the husband or the coworker or
mm,
the sister or whatever that I want to be," we
mm,
say, "Oh, I'm a bad person. I'm a
mm,
crappy father. I'm a terrible, whatever." And I think shame shuts us down, but
mm,
it doesn't motivate reparative behavior. It doesn't motivate us to figure out how to do better. And so what compassion and CFT does is it helps us pause and
mm,
sort of look at our anger and ourselves as beings who experience it, and to understand that experience in a compassionate way, to understand that anger is a feeling that
mm,
everybody has sometimes, and that when we delve into our own sort of unique personal histories,
mm,
we can almost always sort of figure out how it makes sense that
mm,
I would struggle with anger as opposed to
mm,
struggling with this or struggling with that. And what that does is it allows someone to approach the anger in a way that isn't avoidant and it isn't attacking and
mm,
it isn't sort of fusing with it. It's this awareness that, yeah, this is something I struggle with and it's not my fault. I didn't choose to struggle
mm,
with. This isn't something that's bad about me necessarily. But if I want to
mm.
have a good life and good relationships, I need to figure out how to express this and to work with this feeling in better ways. And so I think
Mm,
the role of compassion in working with anger is really helping us to approach it and to take responsibility for it, and then to, to motivate us to do the difficult work it takes to learn how to manage it.
mm. So understanding the function is about the shaming, and the shaming, therefore, is about us being able to take action, to take responsibility.
Absolutely. So if we can de-shame the experience of anger and recognize, of course, this is something I'd
Mm,
struggle with, that opens up
mm,
the question of, okay, given that I struggle with this, and given it makes all the sense in the world that I would struggle with
mm,
this, what would be helpful, right? What does that angry
mm,
version of me need to be able to
mm,
slow down and approach things a little more thoughtfully? What would the and we can look beneath the anger, because a lot of times anger's sort of an interesting emotion because it can function as a primary
mm,
emotion, right? If something is attacking us, we can have a
mm,
primary anger response, but a lot of times it functions as a secondary emotion. A lot of times uh,
mm,
we use anger to not feel other emotions that are more
mm,
vulnerable, like grief or fear or
mm,
anxiety or sadness. And so, part of what
mm,
compassion gives us as well in working with anger is if there's a lot
mm,
of pain and suffering underneath that anger, or unmet
mm,
needs, or grief, or mourning, or whatever, it gives us a way to approach that too, in a
mm.
way that doesn't mislabel it as weakness or something like that.
And we also know that, for instance, men express depression in a different way. And for instance, it may be expressed as anger. So very angry men are often very depressed men. So my next question is actually about the difference between women and men experiencing and expressing anger. So what is the difference based on your
Well,
experience, Russell?
first, I want to start by saying, um, anytime we make broad generalizations like this, like I'm about to
Mm.
make, we're going to be wrong a lot of the time.
Mm,
It's sort of incorrect to say this is the way men do it, this is the way women do it, because
mm,
within men and women and people who are
mm.
non-binary, people who don't identify
Mm,
as
mm,
male or female, um, there's a lot of variability in how it
yeah.
plays
Mhm,
out, and it can be reversed.
mm,
Everything I say that's typical of men or women, you're going to find men or women who are the opposite of that. And so I just want
mm,
to say that very clearly, that so
mm,
much of this has to do with socialization at the
mm,
cultural level, but also at the family and the individual sort of family systems
mm,
level. And so you can end up with very different dynamics depending on the person's
mm,
background. But I think it's fair to say, if we look at the influence of traditional gender roles,
mm,
which I have to say, I'm kind of surprised that traditional gender roles still reverberate in our culture as
mm,
much as they do in 2023.
mm,
I remember like looking at a traditional gender role measure in like 1991 or 1990 as an
mm,
undergraduate. I think I used one of those measures. I'm looking at that, and I just sort of assumed that 30 years from now, that stuff will be completely archaic, right? And it's still reverberates in the
mm,
culture. I
mm,
still see a lot of men who, if they notice themselves feeling
mm,
afraid or feeling sad or
mm,
becoming tearful, they interpret that as meaning I'm weak. There's something
mm,
wrong with me, right? And so they
mm,
cover it up with anger because they believe, that anger is manly. It's okay for men.
mm,
They've been socialized that this is the emotion that it's
mm,
okay for me to express. I saw a meme on social media probably about 6 months ago, and I thought it was brilliant, right? How many of you know you or the people who are going to be watching this podcast have heard women referred to as the emotional sex, right? There's this
mm,
stereotype that women are emotional, women are
mhm,
more emotional. I thought this meme nailed it. They said women only
mm.
became the emotional sex when men successfully rebranded anger as not an emotion.
Oh, that's great.
Because if you factor in anger, men are every bit as emotional as women. Women traditionally, though, have been socialized, I think it's fair to say, socialized to express a different set of emotions. So historically, if you look at depictions of women, many times in art and in other sort of cultural artifacts, have been cast as vulnerable. It's okay for women to be vulnerable or weak or in need of rescuing, et cetera, et cetera. All that stuff that isn't true at all. But again, it's the kind of cultural casting of those things. And so what happens is I think we've had generations and generations of girls who were sort of raised with these implicit messages that said, it's okay for you to be scared. It's okay for you to be sad. That's the way women are. But you can't be angry. You can't be angry. You can't speak. I would say there are a lot of messages historically. You can't even be assertive, right? You can't even like assertively say what you think or what you mean because, oh, heaven forbid, that would be unladylike. And I think, some of the language I'm using, ladylike, is clearly outdated, but I think the message still filters through. I think there are a lot of girls that still get the message. It's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to be anxious, but you can't be angry. And I think a lot of boys say or get the message, you can be angry, but you better not be weak. You better not be scared. Don't be a sissy. So, and so of course that's going to manifest how people express anger, right? So I think you see every kind of anger problem in every kind of gender. But I think proportionally speaking, we're probably more likely to see men struggling with externalized, ragey looking anger and women who, we talked about depression. I think there are a lot of people and a lot of women who look depressed, but one of the things the treatment for the depression has to do is actually helping them get in touch with their anger, to actually acknowledge. I think a lot of times underneath women's depression is suppressed anger. It's big parts of their experience and their personalities that haven't been allowed to be expressed. And so I've got actually I just finished reviewing the copy edits on a new book called The Anger Workbook. And in it, as opposed to the first anger book I wrote, we've got a big component in that is working with suppressed anger. There's actually a female character who's working with repressed anger that she feels ashamed every time, not only when she behaves angrily, but even notices anger in her. It triggers, oh, there's something wrong with me. I shouldn't be like that, which has gotten in the way of her being assertive. And so she's worked with that. So I think that, we see these gender differences. And I think, what I've talked about have been anchored in like traditional gender messaging. And I don't think it captures the experience of everybody, but I've been surprised at how much those stereotypes still tend to reverberate in the culture.
So how do we go about teaching compassion to men? What would be the difference? Because that's a question I'm often asked, Russell.
So I think there are two parts to that. I think first off, the best way to make better men is to help boys. I think if we can create contexts in which boys are, there's space for them to have the same emotions, to have the full range of emotions. And so they don't learn all the tricky things, that they're not allowed to be scared, that they're not allowed to be sad, that they always have to be dominant or in control, that they're supposed to be the sexual aggressors. I mean, there are lots of these things that are sort of wrapped up in how boys are socialized. That then, what's really interesting is I think men are in a tricky spot culturally right now, because I think the culture is sort of waking up to some of the sort of the toxic behaviors that tend to be encompassed in traditional masculinity. And I think at a cultural level, we're able to point at a lot of those behaviors and say, well, that's not very good. That's bad. We shouldn't do that.
Mm.
Shouldn't do that. But the
Mm.
problem is we're still socializing boys the same way. So
Mm.
I think that a lot of men, are in this situation where as men, they're behaving in the ways they were prepared to behave. They're exhibiting the
Mm.
exact behaviors they were trained to exhibit at boys. And then they've got a culture saying, well, that's bad. You shouldn't
Mm.
do that. And their experience is, I'm just being the man you told
Mm.
me to be. I'm trying to be the man that I was taught to be growing up.
Mm.
And I think that creates a lot of anger, and it creates a lot of hopelessness for men. I think it creates
Mm.
a real trick, because it's actually, I think there are a lot of men out there that maybe sort of know and are certainly getting the message that the way they're
Mm.
being as men in the world is not great. They're not,
Mm.
they're creating problems, but they don't know any other way to be. This is
Mm.
the gender role they were taught at so
Mm.
many levels growing up in the culture. And so
Mm.
I think the easiest way to address this is to give boys a different message of manhood. So as they
Mm.
learn to be men, they're not in this tiny little box that has historically existed. The problem
Mm.
is, how do boys learn to be men? By watching men. So we're in kind of a tricky thing. If we've got men that have socialized
Yeah.
in one way, it's
Mm.
very hard for them to raise
Mm.
boys to be different to that. So I think the other
Mm.
thing we need to do is to help give men a way to change
Mm.
that isn't othering. I think
Mm.
that when I have these conversations with men, it starts in very much the way I'm talking about this now. I'm trying to
Mm.
connect with them and with the frustration they have about
Mm.
what they're being told about the problems with men,
Mm.
and the trap I
Mm.
was just kind of talking about. And
Mm.
if you can get
Mm.
men to go, yeah, that's what it's like. It's like my whole life I was
Mm.
taught this is how I should be, and now when I act like that, people get mad. And if we can help them have compassion for that, if we can help them recognize
Mm.
this really is tricky, this really is a tricky
Mm.
spot they're in, and yet, and we can do better.
Mm.
And what if instead of just getting stopped by
Mm.
the feelings of unfairness around,
Mm.
that issue I just talked about, what if we said, yeah, this is it. The culture is moving on.
Mm.
The culture is, we're
Mm.
hopefully getting better in how we understand these things.
Mm.
And the way I was socialized growing up is
Mm.
was problematic in some ways. How can I change to be a
Mm.
better man, to reflect the values that I have now, in a way that doesn't
Mm.
require me to give up who I am? Because
Mm.
it's interesting. As you know, I've done some volunteer work in prisons, and I've worked with angry men in
Mm.
lots of different contexts. And what I
Mm.
find is that the same guys who are manifesting anger in these really tricky,
Mm.
hostile ways
Mm.
also have these beautiful hearts, and they're loving, they're caring, they're devoted
Mm.
parents and neighbors. They'd help anybody. They're good
Mm.
people. And there's just this tricky disconnect between how they learned how to be men
Mm.
and what's really required
Mm.
to be a functional man in 2023. And so I think if we can start with compassion for the fact that this is actually tricky, right?
Mm.
The culture is changing in ways that are tricky, and we need to change too, and that's
Mm.
hard. And then to say, well, given that,
Mm.
what are some steps we can take? What do we do? And
Mm.
I have to say, I've found men. That's one of the reasons I love CFT. CFT, one of the things compassion focused therapy does, this model Paul Gilbert created, it does a really good job of articulating why things are so tricky in a non-blaming
Mm.
way. Like, what are the tricky
Mm.
bits? And it helps people go, oh yeah, when you're going through the model in CFT, the three systems
Mm.
of emotion and the tricky brain stuff, it's immediately accessible. People can immediately relate it to their own experience and go, yeah, that's what it's like. And once they've had that experience, it sort of helps them give themselves permission to keep going. And instead of being stuck and saying, nah, screw you, you're the problem, I am how I am. If we can go, well, actually, the way I am is kind of problematic, and oh, it's because of this and this and this and this, and none of that's my fault, and I don't want to be the problem. What would help me be a better version of me? And actually, what kind of version of me would I like to be? What kind of impact do I want to have on the lives of others? Do I want to be someone who causes people to feel threatened? Most men I've worked with will say, no, I want people to feel safe when they're around me. I don't want them to feel threatened. What role do I want to play in the lives of others? Most of the men I've worked with, they want to enhance the lives of the people they're around, not make them worse. So when we can help people recognize that, yeah, the tricky parts make sense and they're not my fault and they are genuinely difficult, but here's what I really care about and here's the version of me I want to be. Let's explore together how to get there. They're all in. I think, but I think that's the message. One of the big messages of CFT is if we can pull the shame off, if we can help ourselves not be so defensive about the areas we struggle, it helps us ask the question, what would be helpful in doing better? And that question I have found is the gateway to all sorts of good things. And at that point, people can use in the realm of anger, for example, all the wonderful anger management tools we have. We have lots of wonderful, great anger management tools. The world did not need Russell Kolts to write a book further articulating anger management tools. We got a lot of good ones we have for years. It's about helping people use them and stay motivated to use them and work them and do the effort to actually change their lives. That's the hard part. We've got a lot of stuff that works. It's about helping people support themselves in doing the difficult work to make the change.
So how did you get into CFT, if I may ask a personal question, Russell? How did it all start?
Some will have heard this story, I suspect. It relates very directly with what we're talking about. I historically struggled with anger and irritability. I think I mentioned that in a TEDx talk I did. That's why I kind of laughed when you invoked that description of perpetually chill. Yeah, historically, that's not me. I struggle with anger, not in like a ragey, lose my job, lose relationships way, but in a way that, I would behave in ways that didn't fit with the kind of person I wanted to be. And what happened was, 17, 18 years ago, my son Dylan came into the world, and I saw myself manifesting behaviors for him that I didn't want to pass in front of him. I saw myself modeling things in front of him that I didn't want to pass on to him. I didn't want him to struggle with the same things I had struggled with. And it just so happened at that point, as I was sort of having this revelation, or maybe I had the revelation because this was happening, I was also reading a book called Awakening the Buddha Within by Lama Surya Das. And actually that was the second book. The first book I was reading, I actually jumped ahead. I had a student actually who had a very difficult relationship with her mother. She had an abusive relationship with her mother when she was growing up. Her mother was very volatile, punishing, harsh. And she had this situation where her mother also had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. And she wanted to be there to care for her mother, but she hated her mother because of all the pain her mother had caused her. And so she was caught. I want to be here to take care of her, but she hurt me so bad. I don't know what to do. And so I said that a very psychologist-y thing, right? I said, well, sounds like you need to work on forgiveness, right?
Oh, goodness.
So, but anyway, that evening I said, well, I shouldn't just tell her that. I should try and help. So I got on the internet. I started looking for books on forgiveness to see if I could find
Mm,
something good. And I knew
mm,
that she had kind of at least a passing interest in Buddhism. And I found
mm,
this book called The Wisdom of Forgiveness. And it said it
mm,
was by His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. Now, it
mm,
actually wasn't written by His Holiness. It was written by a man named
mm,
Victor Chan, who I believe lives in Vancouver, Washington, or Vancouver, BC, rather. Um,
mm,
but it was about His Holiness. And
mm,
the website I was on had like a buy one, get one free sale. So I ordered a couple of these copies of this book, gave one to the student, and said, you might find this interesting. And then I read one myself. Well, the student read it, and you should know, actually, she ended up taking a quarter or two off of university to care for her
mm,
mother, was able
mm,
to work with those feelings, uh, uh,
mm.
cared for her mother through her mother's passing, and I'm very proud of her. She did a great job. Um, for my part, since I had a copy of the book too, I read it, and it turned out it wasn't about the kind of forgiveness that I had thought it was about at all.
Mm,
It was about the Dalai Lama talking about forgiving basically the Chinese for what happened in
mm,
Tibet.
mm,
But within it was all this stuff about compassion and just His Holiness and these different
mm,
so the way He is in the world. And I remember I finished that book and I was like, well, that's it. That's the kind of
mm,
father I want my son to have. Not the leader of a world religion, but all those qualities and characteristics that His
mm,
Holiness manifested. I'm like, I want to be more like, I'm the only one
mm.
in the world who's ever thought that, right? Who's looked at His Holiness and thought, I want to be more like that guy, right? But that's really what I had. I want to be more like that. I want more of
Mm,
that stuff, that whatever that mojo he's got. I want some of that in my life. And it
mm,
turned out we had a Tibetan center, a local Tibetan center in Spokane, Tibetan Buddhist, a Nyingma center
mm,
actually. And I started practicing there. And I practiced
mm,
there for about 3 years. And at the end, I ended up sort of stepping away for a little bit because at that point I had hit a point with that particular lama, and she was sort of pushing me to do practices around transferal of
mm,
consciousness after death. And I was enough of a
mm,
scientist. I couldn't figure out a
mm,
mechanism of reincarnation. That was a
mm,
sticking point for me. Rebirth was a sticking point for me. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but I can't figure out a mechanism for how it would happen. So I'm kind of, I don't know about
mm,
that. And so I told her that. I initially said, well,
mm,
I don't know about these practices. She says, no, the practices are fine. You're lazy. Do it. And I'm like, no, I'm not lazy. I don't know about this. Right. But
mm,
it was good because it caused me to pause
mm,
and to reflect on the previous 3 years.
mm,
And what I observed was that my life had changed in exactly the way I hoped it would, that I
mm,
had changed in really profound ways. And when I thought about, what were the things that stand out to me as really helping me change, it was the compassion practices. And I'd
mm,
done a lot of them, but it was the compassion practices. I'd read a lot of
mm,
books on Buddhism, and I'd done a lot of practices and a lot of different things. But it was a lot of retreats. But it was the
mm,
compassion practices that had really been transformative to me. And I'm kind of a mediocre scientist, but I know a lot of great scientists. But I'm kind of okay. But
mm,
I'm enough of a scientist to sort of be
mm,
uncomfortable, reaching into a spiritual tradition and pulling out a practice
mm,
and plopping it down in the therapy room. So I
mm,
didn't want to do that. But I knew it's like this compassion stuff has been the most powerful mechanism of change in my life. I've got to find a way to bring this to my
mm,
clients. And I'm betting I'm not the only person in psychology who has ever had this thought.
mm,
So I went to the literature and through kind of a roundabout way found my way to Paul Gilbert, who at that point had just sort of he'd been building CFT for quite some
mm,
time, and it had named it fairly recently, I think, maybe for a while, but there wasn't a lot out there yet. The first
mm,
CFT, I think the Distinctive
mm,
Features book was in manuscript form at that point. The Compassionate Mind had come out,
mm,
I think, was the one book that was maybe out at that time, or maybe not even. But I found Paul, and so he invited me over to to attend a workshop he was giving, and it was 2008, 2009, I think. And I went in, and I just blew my mind. He and I think Chris Irons presented this workshop on CFT. And like a lot of people, I think it was, I think I'd been striving to sort of grab and put together ideas and never quite managed it. And there it was. It's like there was this feeling that here's sort of what I've been searching for. And so what was really interesting, though, is at that point, it's just a lot. I mean, if you've ever been to an introductory CFT workshop, there's a lot of stuff on evolution and attachment and just all kinds of stuff. And I remember, like, I'm on the plane back to the States, and I'm feeling two things. The first was like, this is it. This is going to be what I do for the rest of my life. I love this model. This is going to be my thing. And the second part was, I have no idea what to do with a client. I have no idea how to translate all this stuff I just learned into what do you do in the therapy room. And actually answering that question has really been what my career has been about ever since. Right? I've been trying to sort of translate what I've learned about CFT into what do we do in the therapy room with the clients. And more recently, how do we use all aspects of the therapeutic interaction? So, for example, in CFT, I think there can be a misconception. I think a lot of novice therapists who go to a CFT workshop or two think about CFT in terms of, okay, well, we talk about evolution a lot, and then we do these practices, in kind of a mechanistic way. And what I'm really interested in articulating now is how do we use, this forum we have when we're interacting with clients to help support the arising of compassion, right? What conditions facilitate that? How do we model, not just in terms of what we're doing, but how we're doing it? How do we model compassion and things like courage and empathy and sympathy and distress tolerance? How do we selectively elicit and shape those behaviors and ways of being in our clients? And then, of course, the practices. So there are lots of different levels in which we can teach compassion. That they're the techniques, but they're deeper than that. It goes down to the basic ways we relate to our clients. And if we're thoughtful and intentional about that, I think every part of the therapeutic interaction can help shape and facilitate and support and model compassion. And help people relate to their challenges in these compassionate ways that really enable them to take responsibility for their lives in ways they haven't before.
So it's not really about the technique, but rather about how we approach anything that we do. So we might be doing psychodynamic work or gestalt, but it's more about the way that we approach it. And so it's not about just a copy and paste exercise.
Absolutely. Now, I'm not saying that practices don't matter. What I'm saying is they're tools, and they're very effective tools, but very effective tools have to be chosen carefully and matched well to the job you're doing. Right? So any gardener knows, if you're doing a job in your garden, if you grab the wrong tool for it, if you grab a hoe when you need a shovel, or it's not going to work so well. So so it's the techniques need to be embedded in a context, and in CFT, I think, and in psychotherapy generally, it's a relational context, and I think that therapeutic relationship can be utilized in ways that are really powerful when one of the targets that we've sort of identified in therapy that we want to facilitate is compassion. I think that relational context creates a wonderful way, a context in which we can support the arising of compassion. For example, social safeness. There's a study, Phil Shaver and Mario McCullinser did a whole series of studies on attachment security. And what they found is this, even briefly, if you help people connect with experiences of relational safeness, feeling safe by relating or remembering people that care about them,
mm,
creativity increases, compassion increases, pro-social behavior increases. So we
mm,
know this. So in terms of the therapeutic relationship, we can, there are lots of techniques we can use to help people develop compassion, but we
mm,
know the extent to which I can
mm,
help you feel safe in this moment with
mm,
me is going to pave the way. You're naturally going to tend
mm,
to be more compassionate then if I can
mm,
achieve that end. Even though we haven't talked about
mm,
compassion, if you feel safe,
mm,
that's going to pave
mm,
the way for that compassion to flow forth from you. That, I think, is one of the silver linings. We talk about the tricky
mm,
brain and how tricky humans are all the
mm,
time in CFT, and we are tricky. But there are also some things about human beings that make us really beautiful, really
mm,
beautiful. And one of the things that makes us really beautiful is that when we feel safe, we will tend to help one another. When we feel
mm,
safe and we're treated kindly, kindness will tend to flow forth from us. And, for some
mm,
people, if we haven't felt safe for a long time and we've learned harsh or cruel ways of trying to be powerful in the world, that can be a hard road. It doesn't happen automatically because we've covered that tendency up with all
mm,
these learned rank based sorts of
mm,
things that we do. Um,
mm,
but underneath all of that is this capacity to care and to be kind.
mm,
And when we feel safe and connected, we'll tend to do that.
mm.
And I think that's beautiful.
So, mm, yeah, I think this should be emphasized, Russell. Um, so, in terms of current affairs of psychotherapy, what do you think is missing, or maybe what we should be focusing more on?
In CFT or more broadly?
Both.
I think in CFT, in terms of research, we just sort of need more. I think we
Mm,
need more randomized controlled trials because those are sort of seen as the gold standard in terms of is a therapy
mm,
empirically supported or not. So we need more of those, and we've got some good researchers working
mm,
real hard on that. I think we need more sort of process based research that looks at what are
mm,
the sort of critical elements in
mm,
CFT, that so we can talk a little more precisely about why the stuff
mm,
I think the evidence is building that it works. It's nice to be able to
mm,
talk precisely about how that works in a way that
mm,
is linked specifically to data,
mm,
right? I do think that Paul Gilbert in the new kind of the large CFT book that came out a year or two ago
mm,
uh, talks much more specifically about sort of the mechanisms
mm,
that underlie CFT,
mhm,
and I think he's really help develop that in
mm,
terms of our understanding of how and why it works and should work. But I think we always need as much empirical data as we can that speaks to
mhm,
those things. One of the things that I see when I look at the CFT literature um, that I really like, that I don't always see when I look at the
mm,
literature that supports other therapy models, though, is we've got a strand
mhm,
of CFT researchers that I don't know how they started. Maybe they just started with a qualitative bent. I know Tobin Bell, my dear friend Tobin Bell,
mm,
is kind of one of
mm,
the foremost people in this camp. Tobin sort of modestly says, "Well, I knew I didn't want to do statistics, so I had to figure out another way to do research." I think he's being a little humble there. But we've got a strand of researchers in CFT, of
mm,
really good qualitative researchers who
mm,
are doing this sort of series, and there are a few of them. Tobin and Allison
mm,
uh, uh, are the people that I think sort of started doing that work, and others have sort of followed suit.
mm,
But where they sort of focus in on a
mm,
specific sort of CFT intervention, be it
mm,
chair work or a particular imagery exercise or something like this, and then get a small sample of people and sort of
mhm,
in a qualitative way deeply study what their experience of
mm,
the treatment is, and what actually, when they say what stood out to me and what changed for me,
mm,
and really zeroing in and picking out the
mm,
themes that emerge when you ask people these sorts of questions. And I really love that about the CFT literature, because I think
Mm,
it's giving us a depth of understanding of how these interventions work that I haven't seen actually when I've looked at the literature at other therapy models nearly as much. Now, in fairness, it may be there. I'm more familiar with the literature on CFT than I am with other therapy models. So
mm,
I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I'm saying I have seen it in CFT, and that's really
mm,
exciting to me. And I'd like to see more of
mm,
that, not just in CFT, but in the psychotherapy world in
mm,
general. To
mm,
back out to look, take a broader view on psychotherapy research in general. One of the things that really is exciting to me is the focus on looking at change processes. And I think
mm,
there are a lot of people. There was a book by Steve Hayes and Stefan Hoffman a few years ago.
mm,
There's even a variation that kind of broke out of the ACT community called process-based behavioral psychotherapy, that's
mm,
based in out of Ireland and elsewhere. And so I think from different angles, I think a lot of people in psychology are becoming like less interested in pushing my brand of psychotherapy
mm,
and more interested in asking the question, what do we know about what
mm,
process shifts tend to be really helpful in helping
mm,
people? What do we know about the sorts of interventions that
mm,
everyone needs to be doing,
mm,
right? And the processes we need to be targeting. And I think
mm,
there's a lot more research that's being done looking at what are the crucial processes that need to be targeted and they need to shift for people. I think
mm,
compassion is one of those processes that we're seeing is a really
mm,
powerful process that we need, that
mm,
that is very helpful to shift for people. And I actually, and I'm not the only one, obviously, and certainly not the first one to say this, but I think that's the future, honestly, of
mm,
psychotherapy. I think we historically there've been a lot of competitions between the different therapy camps. My therapy
mm,
is better. No, I think we just need to realize, as I think people are, we're all on the same team.
mm,
We're all trying to
mm,
do the same thing, figure out the best way to help people, and to do the sort of research that
mm,
identifies, regardless of the label, what are the things we
mm,
need to be doing in terms of
mm,
therapists' abilities and repertoire, that I think are going to be most helpful. And I think one of those,
mm,
honestly, is therapists' context sensitivity. Our ability to notice,
mm,
when do I do what, rather than
mm,
having a set of cookie cutter techniques that I just apply
mm,
in a certain order to every client. To be able to notice what are the markers of the moments in therapy in which this particular sort of process focused intervention is going to be particularly helpful. Um, the
mm,
reason that I like CFT so much is that I think the compassion, helping people relate to their struggles in a way that's
mm,
based in understanding and approach rather than avoidance or self shaming, I
mm,
think that's kind of like a bowl you can put just about every effective therapy technique into.
mm,
And I think that
mm,
it's something that will enhance. We've already got evidence that, if you
mm,
combine CFT with some EMDR, it works,
mm,
right? There's some studies, and there
mm,
are other studies looking at that. And so I think there's nothing like that's fundamentally incompatible
mm,
about between CFT and just about any other sort of data supported
mm,
therapeutic intervention that's out there. So if you're a
mm,
CFT therapist, you can do exposure therapy, and
mm,
you can do behavioral activation, and you can do et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's nothing incompatible.
mm,
And in doing that, I think the compassion focus can
mm,
perhaps enhance the power of these other
mm,
interventions that we already sort of know are helpful, but maybe more or less accessible for particular
mm,
patients. Maybe we can make them more
mm.
accessible, for example.
It's similar to what Paul Gilbert was saying, that we should drop this idea of different therapeutic camps, like
Yeah.
therapeutic tribes. We should have the one handbook for psychotherapy, and we need more research because we have these various techniques and concepts, and much of it hasn't been researched that well. Let's be honest about that. So.
Yeah.
Um, what is really helpful, and what is the most helpful, going back to your original question, in
Yeah.
terms of our personal life and as and our helping professions as well. So my very last question, Russell, is how to live according to Russell Kolts.
So, how to live according to Russell Kolts? Well, I'm going to give you my best shot here. So, actually, I've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about this in terms of
Mm,
like future research directions and things that I'm interested
mm,
in my own sort of professional life in the future. Um, and I think that um, there's a lot of stuff we know about how to have a happy,
mm,
healthy human life. The good news is that we know a lot about how to do that. The bad news is
mm,
that those elements are a lot of times uncomfortable and they're effortful
mm,
and they require some
mm,
some discipline to manifest regularly. So for example, I think the purest form of self-compassion perhaps is basic self-care. Like getting
mm,
curious in, what are the factors in my life that are present when I'm struggling and that trigger me when I'm having a hard time? And what are the factors that tend to be present when things are going well and I'm feeling good and my
mm,
relationships are going well and I'm effective and I'm functioning well in my different contexts? And so I think, one message I'd like to communicate to everybody is that I think curiosity is a superpower. And I would encourage you, get really curious to notice what are the factors that tend to predict,
mm,
things going better for me, and what are the factors that tend to be present, and what are the things I'm doing when things are
mm,
going well. And then as we notice those things, find ways to build what we learn into our lives. And
mm,
we don't actually have to start from scratch from that. We know that human lives go better when people eat a relatively healthy diet, when people refrain from excess in terms of alcohol and drug use and things like this, when people move their bodies 20 or 30 minutes a
mm,
day, get regular exercise, when people sleep 7 or 8 hours a day, if we get sufficient sleep, we know that our lives tend to be better when we do those things. It's
mm,
not everything, but it's a lot. And so,
mm,
you know, what I would encourage people to do is find out when you notice things are helpful for me, get curious about how to build that into your life,
mm,
and and be curious also. And I think here where compassion comes in. How do I keep myself motivated to keep
mm,
doing those things, to keep going even when I don't feel like it, even with it when it's hard, because frankly, I mean, if it was easy, we'd all exercise every day, right? If it was convenient, we'd all eat healthy every day.
mm,
Um, but what helps us make those choices and to build them into habit? I think
mm,
compassion plays a big role in that. If we can recognize that, I want to help myself and I want to be a version of me
mm,
that is the sort of friend and the sort of partner and the
mm,
sort of parent that I want to
mm,
be, and so to get curious about what are the things that are helpful with that. And I think one of the
mm,
things that's really helpful is when we see ourselves struggling, instead of falling back to that tendency to say, "Oh, I'm struggling because I'm actually not a very good father. I'm a crappy
mm,
parent or partner or friend or whatever." Instead of saying,
mm,
"Well, does it make sense given what I know about me and my
mhm,
life and everything I learned and everything that
mm,
happened and all the cultural
mm,
influences that acted upon me? Does it make sense that I would struggle in this
mm,
way?" The answer to that question
mm,
is always yes, right? Our struggles, by definition, occur within contexts in which they make sense.
mm,
That's why I struggle with stuff you don't struggle with,
mm,
and perhaps vice versa. I don't
mm.
know if you struggle or not, Julia, but if you do, I bet you struggle with things I perhaps don't, some of them. And once we've answered yes, okay, so I'm struggling.
Mm,
It makes sense I would
mm,
struggle. What would be helpful given that?
mm,
Given that I'm having a hard
mm,
time, given that it makes complete sense that I would,
mm,
what would help me be the best version of me
mm,
as I work with whatever this tricky sort of situation is? And so I
mm,
guess that's what's what's Russell's prescription for a good life. Stay curious about what helps and what gets in the way. Try to find ways to weave those things you learn into your life. Weave in
mm,
the things that are helpful. Try to mitigate the things that are not. Um, Particularly around feeling safe. If you can figure out what the things that help me feel safe and
mm,
build those relationships, build those
mm,
experiences, because the more we feel safe, generally, the better
mm,
versions of ourselves will be. And the third is when we struggle, when we're having a hard time, and the tendency to beat
mm,
ourselves up or to shut down shows up, instead try and connect with compassion and just
mm,
recognize it makes sense that I would struggle with this, and then get curious. Okay, given that I'm struggling and it makes sense, what would be helpful? And then we just keep
mm.
going and get a little better and a little better and a little better, and then we die, and that's fine.
So the basic and ongoing question of compassion, what would be helpful? And how can we tell that it's in fact helpful?
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think the other thing, and I built in a tricky bit at the end, and I want to qualify that. I think a lot of times we have this idea that we just need to figure out what we need to do
Mm,
and then do it, and then everything will be
mm,
happily ever after. I mean, we've got this
mhm,
phrase, right? Happily ever after.
mm,
I don't know that exists. Like without like intentional maintenance,
mm,
I don't think that happens. I don't think there's anything we can do that we do it for a
mm,
brief period of time and then we fix everything and then everything's
mhm,
easy. I think one of the
mm,
lessons of compassion and compassion focused therapy, Paul Gilbert's told us a lot, is that having a human life is inherently difficult.
mm,
And there are a lot of struggles that we'll face.
mm,
And, Buddhism talks about this a lot. If we make our lives about manicuring everything and getting it perfect,
mm,
we'll never get there. And if we do, it'll be for like a second and then something will happen and it'll
mm,
fall apart again. So if we can begin to recognize that, no, this is, having the life I want is that's a lifelong process,
mm,
right? And that we're all
mm,
the whole time, we're just moving through, doing the best we can, struggling with the things there are to struggle, and just trying to get a little better every day, get a
mm,
little better at it, you know, but recognizing that we're never there. We're never at the point
mm,
where, oh, we're done and it's going to be easy, you know.
mm, mm. But it might be a little bit easier, at least
Oh,
with compassion.
and much
Mm,
easier. Yeah.
mm,
We're never done. Yeah, much easier with compassion.
mm, mm,
And much deeper and more
mm,
meaningful and more beautiful.
mm, mm. So I think that's a beautiful way of ending our conversation. So thank you so much, Russell. Uh, do have a good life, and wishing a good life to all of our listeners. So thank you so much again, Russell.
Oh, thank you, Julia. It's an honor to be on your podcast.